Good morning. My name is Steve Blinn of the Traffic Club of Chicago, and welcome to this edition of the Traffic Club of Chicago Traffic Jam Podcast. Today, I have the distinct honor and privilege to interview Chairman Dan Maffei of the Federal Maritime Commission. During our time together, we will learn about Mr. Maffei's pathway in the building of a most impressive and masterful career, and maybe glean a bit about him and his passions along the way. Dan Maffei is an experienced public servant who serves as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission since being appointed to the position by President Biden in 2021. Under his chairmanship, the commission has reinvigorated its enforcement efforts, prioritized helping U.S. export shippers, and established several new initiatives to address supply chain congestion and efficiency challenges. Chairman Maffei's career in government spans more than 20 years. He was twice elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for the 24th Congressional District of New York, with assignments to the House Armed Services Committee, House Financial Services Committee, and the House Judiciary Committee. His earlier public service includes working for the Democratic staff of the House Ways and Means Committee and as press secretary for U.S. Senators Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Bill Bradley. Maffei has substantial experience teaching and researching at universities and think tanks. In addition to his career as a public servant, Maffei has worked in the private sector as an independent consultant and as a broadcast journalist. He earned his bachelor's degree from Brown University and his master's degrees from Columbia University and Harvard University. Mr. Maffei, wow. With all humble sincerity, your short bio is most impressive. Please tell the audience how you got started in your career and your pathway to current FMC chairmanship duties you hold today.
Hey, well, thanks very much, Steve. And it's great to be on this program. And I thank the Traffic Club of Chicago for giving you this platform to interview, I guess, people like me. Yeah, that bio sounds pretty impressive when you read it. It wasn't as directed when I was going through it. I think the way I got started was like many of us, just decided to go to college and tried to get into the best college that I could get into. And there were a number of different choices. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do, frankly, when I grew up. And so the one I picked, Brown, actually, in some ways is the easiest to go to when you don't have a major. Unlike yourself, I didn't serve in the armed services, to be frank with you, from my, some service in my family. Of course, my grandfather during World War II, and I have an uncle that was in the reserves. But for the most part, we weren't a military family, so it just never occurred to me to go into the service. So, went to college, and that's where I really developed interest in public affairs, journalism, and communications, broadly speaking. I also did, was, I guess, the first time I was interested in a lot of transportation stuff. I, studied cities and the kinds of transportation that goes on there, far more than I did actually anything intercity, either railroad or maritime. But clearly that sparked an interest, and then we sort of went from there.
Very interesting. And thank you for your service. Your service is wonderful in that capacity that you've served our government in many ways. The audience would love to understand what keeps you excited and passionate about the work you do every day. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us what motivates you every day when you go to work.
Well, I think it's funny. I wasn't an expert in maritime transportation when I came to the commission. I don't consider myself a particular subject expert now. I'm fortunate at the Federal Maritime Commission that we have tremendous depth in terms of our expertise, both in terms of the legal side and economics, et cetera. But what makes me really passionate is the fact that it has a lot to do with how all of us lead our daily lives. And, the reason why I say that is because not because we're a huge agency, we're not, even in a department, we're a separate independent agency of only a little more than 100 people. But what we do affects trillions and trillions of dollars of commerce on the high seas. And in fact, commerce that is connected with virtually everything we do. I think there's a book that's 90% of everything. And that's, the ocean shipping does account for, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 85 and 95% of everything we do and use. And it's even things like exports, a lot of the components come from abroad. And of course, a lot of the products that we farm in the United States and feed the world with go out as exports on container ships. So it's that ability to really be involved in something very substantive. And then, frankly, Steve, after having been in public office, as you mentioned, it was nice, at least for a while, to kind of not have the public eye on us as much. Yeah, sure, people in the industry, including journalists and congressional leaders of transportation committees and et cetera, but not so much the general public, the shipping public, yes, but not so much the general public. And that does give you a little bit more space, I guess, in terms of getting things done and working in a bipartisan way. And I that's one of the things I enjoy the most about this commission is because it's independent, we are also bipartisan. We always have at least two members of each party. We're five altogether. Right now, we're 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, but I've served on the committee as the only Democrat with 2 Republicans and many other different iterations.
Very interesting. So let's build upon that answer and let's dive a little bit deeper. How are you and the Federal Maritime Commission adding value to the supply chain? Moreover, what camaraderie and fellowship are you building with other administrations to build a better supply chain, since it's been in the news so heavily in past several months?
That's a very good question, Steve, partly because the supply chain is very complex. It's really not a chain, as my colleague Rebecca Dye points out. It's better to call it a supply ecosystem. It's got so many inputs, so many outputs, better suited, frankly, for PhD in chaos theory than a sort of a standard business person to sort of take a look at. But it does. There are certain things about it that I think government can do some real good. And that is sort of to provide a referee. And I'll give you an example. A lot of, I've gotten a lot of people calling and say, well, you keep on talking, Maffei, about doing stuff to help our congestion, but really there's nothing you can do, is there? And I say, well, actually there kind of is. All the detention demurrage stuff we keep talking about. Well, these are fees that are put on in order to help move cargo. But what happens if those fees are not used to move cargo, but become something else? What happens if people sometimes can leave their cargo for up to 30 days and not pay any fee, or sometimes pick it up as soon as they possibly can and yet end up paying a fee? Well, the whole system loses credibility. And that is pretty much what happened over the last few years before COVID. And then when COVID hit, all the more. And what we're trying to do, it's not wave a wand and it's done. It's not a decree from above. It is working with the system and using enforcement as a tool to discourage abuse of the system. But what we're trying to do is restore and maybe even enhance credibility of the system, so that when people do get a bill, they know, okay, well, that's because something was late and I could have prevented that. I could have moved it faster, and that will give an incentive to move cargo faster. And because it's such a complex system, the only real way you're going to get rid of the congestion is if every little player in it does their part. And so that's what we're trying to do. Be the referees, trying to make sure that everybody does their part as best as they can, right? I mean, we're not going to, take an iron fist if there's nothing that somebody can do about what they're doing. We know sometimes you have to leave cargo on longer, and for some that's fine, and they just pay the fee. But those fees are there in order to keep cargo moving, in order to make sure there isn't an unchecked externality that if you are contributing to congestion, you're paying for it. And so that's a very good example. There are others, and I don't want to go through them all, but I think it's that restoring some sort of referee. It's a market-based system. But it needs to be a fair playing field.
Absolutely. I agree. And that was a great answer. So let's even build upon that. And let's take a slight step back and reflect. So what is the biggest challenges you've experienced in your vast career? What did you learn from it? Is it something from the past that helped you today, or is it something today that is challenging you? Either way.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've had a lot of challenges in my career, and but it's not maybe what you would think. I mean, losing an election is a challenge, but it's also can be an opportunity. I've found, and I've lost a couple. Maybe there are other areas where it seems like the opposite. I think one of the things that I learned very early on was the importance of communicating, and particularly communicating with people who have to work with a system but don't necessarily feel listened to. I learned that actually as a staff person working for senators and members of Congress. I even knew it before that as a journalist, right? I used to be the sort of the cub reporter. I didn't get the big stories. I was in my early 20s, just out of college, but I got we'll go interview the people around this disaster and find out they call it MOS, man on the street. It's a sexist term now. Maybe they call it POS now, but in any event, so I used to do that. And then, when I went to Capitol Hill, I learned that, as much as people were cynical and would say, oh, the Congress is out of touch, that actually that wasn't true at all. But the senators I worked for and the Congress people I worked for, they were extraordinarily interested in what their constituents and what the American people had to say. Sometimes it was hard to get that because they have to get it through a filtered news media or something like that. But the more I could engage with that, and then of course took that when I was an elected official. Well, what does that have to do with what I'm doing today? In a lot of ways, what I'm doing today is being the same kind of constituent politician that I was when I represented an economically challenged district in upstate central New York. My constituents are not, citizens that live in one congressional district. They're shippers who live and work all over the country. And they're the ones who I think feel kind of lost. They're not the regulated entities like the big carriers, and look, it's important to treat all the people who work at terminals and carriers and intermediaries, freight intermediaries fairly. But the real constituents are the shippers. And I think for a long time, they just didn't feel like they were being quite listened to. Certainly sometimes, Rebecca Dye used to have these sort of conferences where she would bring in shippers to talk about particular things. We call them supply chain conferences. We're trying to, we've done a number of things to kind of make those permanent. But generally speaking, I think that was something that even if it was going on at the FMC, there wasn't any attention. It was hard for people to grasp that. And we've tried to make it a much more active FMC where, we're listening to different groups. We're trying to respond to them, maybe not always perfectly, but at least we're not leaving things fallow. We're sort of trying to figure out what's going on and doing our best to address those issues. So that's probably the biggest lesson is really it's simple, but just listen. Listen to what people have to say. You're not going to satisfy them all the time, that's for sure. But at least you might gain more than you think you're going to gain in terms of figuring out what I want to do is really informed by that.
Absolutely. It's funny how it goes in life on these cycles. And again, your history is magnificent, and I mean that. So in a complete 180 from a challenge, now tell the audience about your biggest accomplishment you've experienced in your vast career, sort of the opposite of, what's troubled you, what's exciting. Tell me about an accomplishment, a huge one.
I mean, the problem with doing that, Steve, I put my historian hat on. Not much of a historian, but I did major in college, and frankly, for fun now, I more read history books.
Yeah.
What seems like an accomplishment one day may seem like a failure the next, and vice versa. I was very happy that we passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. I think when I was appointed chair shortly after President Biden came in office, and I think the thought was there's going to be maybe things can pass in Congress but they're only going to be the big agenda items that the president has, because in order to pass anything, Democrats are going to have to use every chip they have. It's extraordinarily slim majority in the Senate, and not that huge in the House even, and so when this came up, it's like, well, no one's going to pass shipping legislation, right? It's not on people's minds, et cetera. Well, of course, the pandemic changed that. The pandemic was already going on, but I think the way that the industry was going, and a number of other things, and also, of course, getting bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. I don't want to take anything away from the sponsors and co-sponsors of that legislation who are still actively working towards reform, people like Senator Klobuchar and Congressman Dusty Johnson and my good friend John Garamendi from California. But getting that passed in such a short time with such bipartisan support, having all five of us at the White House for that signing, it's not something you see these days in Washington. So that's a big deal. But is it my biggest accomplishment? Well, no, because now I have to implement it, right? I'm not a congressman anymore. I'm the guy who's implementing it, and there's a lot of issues with that. We're trying to make these deadlines. We put out a rule that isn't quite there yet on one matter, and we've got a lot to do. So I don't know. Is that my biggest accomplishment? Getting elected to Congress as a Democrat from an upstate New York district, but I mean, that's important, and the things I stood for were important, and I was a middle of the road Democrat. We have even fewer of those now, and even fewer middle of the road Republicans than Democrats. But so there's a lot of things that I've sort of done in my career that I'm proud of, because maybe they bucked the curve or whatever. But is any of that more of an accomplishment than when I would teach a class and a young person would sort of see politics differently, or go towards wanting to be and maybe actually be the candidate instead of just be behind the scenes. Those are huge accomplishments as well. And so I don't really know. I don't know if I can make that determination. Hopefully I've accomplished something, some good for the country and for people that I've encountered. But I think you wake up every day, you do the best you can, and as long as we all do that, I think that's good enough. I mean, it's not. My biggest accomplishment, hopefully, is the daughter I'm raising and the family I have, and we'll, on the professional side, we'll let others judge.
Yes, challenges and accomplishments are hard to talk about, and I understand.
Yeah, what is this, a job interview, Steve?
It woke up the understanding.
Do I know my greatest weakness next, or I'm sure a lot of your guests feel that way.
Absolutely, and it's not a job interview. It's really to get the public to know, and a different consortium to understand important people and yourself in this business.
But of course, what makes anybody important is other people in their lives. I mean, right. Like I just mentioned, I mean, as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, I can be a leader, and there's a lot, and I do think I have a good handle on some of the big industry trends, and to a certain extent, my background allows me to see those. But in terms of, really making the place work, it's absolutely not in this office. It's everyone else. It's the people who do the payroll, and the people who make sure that everybody's got the right equipment, and it's the lawyers that prosecute cases that are very difficult to gather the evidence, and the economists, I can't even pronounce them, economists who analyze the industry and find trends that you wouldn't necessarily see from the outside, and figure out things to do. I mean, and that's been true my whole life. So I think it's nice of you to say, but for me, I will tell you this: I was certainly a lot more ambitious at earlier stages of my life, and I like to say that nothing cures ambition better than 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. You spend some time in Congress, and there's a lot of things wrong with Congress. They're not necessarily what people think is wrong with Congress, but there's a lot of things wrong with Congress. It's maybe the greatest democratic institution ever created, and yet it's full of flaws. But that is one of those things where you do that, and you do have a different perspective on life and career. And maybe my biggest accomplishment is actually not a career goal accomplishment. It is simply putting things in better perspective than I had before I was 40, moving from 45 after. And that's the one thing that I do. I think it is important to be ambitious when you're young. So I'm not trying to tell anybody not to be, but it is important to keep things in perspective. And hopefully I do that in my personal life, and hopefully I do that in my professional life, right? I mean, the issues we deal with are extremely serious, but anybody I disagree with, anybody on the other side of the table, carrier executive or a shipper who doesn't think we're doing enough for them or whatever, I want to be able to, at the end of the day, say, well, look, I totally respect what you're saying, and let's go get a coffee or what have you.
Yeah, I agree. And to bring it into some other discussion, democracy is a messy business, but it's a wonderful business to be in because we are the greatest country, the United States. So this isn't another interview question. I promise you.
I'm just teasing you, Steve. Ask me anything you want. It's fine.
And I appreciate that, sir. So let's look into the future to whatever capacity you want to look into it. What do you want to accomplish, either through the FMC or something else? And again, it's not an interview question. It's just, is there things that you really want to get done as the FMC chairman, or is there something else you want to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, I think as FMC chairman, look, I think it was important to restore both a referee and the perception that the FMC is a referee, and is an active referee, because ocean shipping is a sort of wild business. I think people know that. It's worldwide. It's deregulated, but frankly, I don't know if you could regulate it if you tried, right? And I have friends in the EU directorates who might agree with me on that. So there's a lot of things that kind of need to be done to make it work better, and for that to happen, the FMC has to be really at its best. And I do think, frankly, it has to be a little bigger and stronger than it is now, and that's what the legislation was for. In terms of my career after this, I mean, I'm not going to stay at the FMC the rest of my career because we are limited, and that's a good thing, right? We want to make sure our public officials don't get too comfortable anywhere, and so but I don't know what that next chapter is, and this may be my biggest flaw if you ask my spouse, because every time I do something, whether it's being in Congress or working at a think tank or now or whatever, I never quite know what the next thing is going to be, and even now into my 50s. But I want to teach. I want to be able to have ideas. I want to sort of use what I've learned through the years. I don't have any great, like I said, I don't have any great ambition to enact some huge change. If a government opportunity arises, of course I'll consider it, and if I can make a difference, I will. Right? I mean, I worked for Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the day, and he used to say, because he got a lot of flack for serving on President George W. Bush's Social Security Commission, and he just used to say, look, when the President of the United States asks you to do something, you say yes. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I still believe in that kind of public service. Steve, I appreciate you thanking me earlier. I thank you for your public service. I also thank you for the stuff you've done in the private sector, because that also keeps the economy going. I think we all make contributions, and I don't think that mine are any better or frankly any worse than anyone else's. And so all I want to do is sort of continue that, and be in a good position. So I get to see my daughter at least twice a day whenever possible.
That's wonderful. Family.
Now, and by the way, and she's only 8 now, but I mean that well into her adulthood. So she'll probably get a tape of this. And
family first.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I waited a while before I had a family, and yeah. I think that makes me a little more appreciative. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. That's a pretty big, bold thing to say. But it was, when you're still sort of lashing about in your 30s, you really appreciate that that kind of stability in a way that maybe a younger person wouldn't.
Absolutely. With age comes wisdom, and so on and so forth, and the younger years. So we'll get you out of here on this one. Okay, this is as inappropriately as time to riff. This is your time to riff, as you would. One last question. Please share the closing thoughts about anything or any message you want to convey to the audience. This is your opportunity to just say what's on your mind and what you'd like to have the audience hear you talk about.
I mean, I think it's impossible these days to, look at the political world and not get very depressed.
Right.
And I don't necessarily mean when you're taking a closest look, but most of us get, including myself, even those of us who do work in Washington, but we get our news from conventional media for the most part. Maybe we branch out into podcasts or newsletters or that sort of thing, and read about a particular industry as mine is, and I think that, and having been both an elected office and now an appointed office, having worked my whole career, even as a staff person, I worked closely with people who had a different view from me. When I was on the Ways and Means Committee, when I started there, I was the Democratic communications guy, and the Republican communications guy was Ari Fleischer. And they're totally different styles, totally different beliefs, and we got along great. And I think that is something that people miss. I don't think that there's that much less of it on a person-to-person level as there ever was. But unfortunately, because of the internet, because of all sorts of things that have a lot of good results, but also have created a system where you only see the tip of the iceberg, and it tends to be the worst, most negative stuff. And I think so. Both in terms of the way one sees the world, I don't think, to be perfectly honest with you, I think if we look at the average, everyday American, and I include myself in that, people are actually no more divided than they ever have been, and maybe even more together because we share more cultural experience with each other. But if you look at the news, you think everybody's at each other's throats. I think that kind of understanding and realizing that, I could just, again, having perspective, even on one's own beliefs. Some of the best things I've done in my career, and I should have mentioned this maybe as an answer, but then you'd ask me for specifics, and I might not want to give specifics on it, but are changing my mind, right? Or letting something I was really passionate about and putting in perspective and going, you know what, that's not worth the fight right now, but this other thing is. And I think it's that, that increasing sense that the people you admire don't compromise. It's just never been true. It's never been true through history. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, was also the great compromiser. You look at Ronald Reagan. I mean, people idolize Ronald Reagan. He compromised with Tip O'Neill all over the place. It was just a different period of time. And I really hope somehow that with a new generations that are more used to this kind of media, more used to not taking everything seriously just because it's in print or whatever, that we do get more perspective on that, and that people do treat each other more as human beings and don't, read something that may have been said somewhere and just cancel people and that sort of thing. So it's just sort of remember other people's humanity. And that's sort of the best I can offer is sort of that kind of addendum, both applicable in my career, but also, the rest of my life as well. And Steve, I can tell from your nodding, applicable in yours, right? We all are after the same things, really. This isn't Star Wars. It isn't the Empire versus the Rebellion. We're all the rebellion and we're all the empire, right? We're all good and we're all bad. Let's just admit that to each other and try to do the best we can to all be better.
Yeah, be kind.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We all fall off that occasionally, right? And we don't even mean to. Right. But whenever you can, just exactly. I mean, hold the door open for women, hold the door open for men. That's right. Basic politeness. And I don't know. Like I said, I work for Pat Moynihan. I work for Bill Bradley. I think you're from Jersey, right?
Yes, sir.
So, yeah. these people I worked for, okay, they were Democrats, but they weren't partisan very often, and they stood for what they believed in, but they also got along. And those are the kinds of values that I take both in public life and try to take right to life in general.
Absolutely, best said. So, Chairman Maffei, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend a bit of time with us today. On behalf of the Traffic Club of Chicago, it was all my honor and privilege to spend this time with you.
Steve, I think the honor and the privilege is all mine, but I very much appreciate your time and effort, and frankly, not just having me on, but this whole program, which I think is a great resource to educate others, old and young, about all of our various careers. I've learned a lot about other people that I wasn't expecting watching some of the programs in preparation for this. So thank you again.
If you want to learn more about the Traffic Club, please visit our website at www.traffic-club.org. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Traffic Jam.